We've covered a lot of ground in both Photoshop and Illustrator at this point, but there is so much more to each one of these programs. So in this bonus lesson, I want to take a look at filters and effects, which are in both Photoshop and Illustrator, and each one has its own way of working. So let's start in Photoshop, and I'm going to need some pictures to work with. So let's just start with this one right here, a picture of a fox. Open this up into Photoshop. And we're going to be spending a lot of time right here in this filter menu. This is where we can find all of our filters and effects. And what this will allow us to do is manipulate our images in various different ways. Now, just like adjustments can be applied to smart objects non-destructively, so can most of the filters here inside of Photoshop. So first thing I'm going to do is convert this to a smart object. Now let's just take a look at the filters list. So there's all different kinds of categories broken up in this menu, and you can pretty much just browse through these and play around with them. That's basically how I learned my way through Photoshop, is just applying a filter and seeing what it does. So let's just start with something simple like noise. We'll go to this and say add noise. See what that does. Well, we get a little menu window that pops up with controls for that specific filter. So this window is giving us a preview of what the effect is actually doing, but we're also seeing the same preview on the overall image. It's just a little bit harder to see because we're not zoomed into 100%. The preview window is giving us this 100% zoom, and we can even zoom in further or zoom out a little bit. But that's what this little preview check mark is going to do, is turn the effect on and off back here. So right now the amount is only set to 4.8%, but if I turn it way up, then we've got a lot of noise being introduced, and it's just some random noise. We also have some options for uniform noise or Gaussian or monochromatic or color. So this is just one example of a filter that you could apply to an image inside of Photoshop. This is basically how most of them work. I'll click OK, and that's added as a smart effect. I'll zoom into 100%, Command 1 on the keyboard or Control 1 on a PC, and I can turn this off and back on just so you can see what that's doing. Add noise is something that I actually do use. It's really great for helping smooth out gradients, because gradients can actually produce this thing called banding, which is just a result of compression. You know, exporting a JPEG compresses the image. You can control the quality of the JPEG, but if you're compressing it a lot for something like the web, then that gradient is going to be a lot more stair-steppy. You're going to see all these individual levels. In fact, let me just show you exactly what I mean so that this isn't just empty words. I'm going to make a new gradient layer, and we're going to fill it with just some crazy colors. Let's make them nice and bright. And then what I'm going to do is add an effect on top of this. And to be able to do that, I'm going to convert it to a smart object. I'm going to come up to image adjust, and then come all the way down to posterize. There we go. What this is going to do is basically strip down my layer into a certain number of colors. So if the number is really low, this gets really chunky, but I could turn this up to somewhere around here, and this is a pretty good, pretty accurate representation of what banding is in compression. If I were to export this as a JPEG at a high compression rate, then you're going to see all these individual bands of color, just like this posterize effect is simulating. So to counteract something like that, you can add a little layer of noise, and it does not need to be this much, just a small amount, something like maybe 5. And that would be enough to break up those colors in the gradient and make it randomized enough that the compression won't be able to group all those colors together very easily. So anyway, that's a long explanation into a deep topic, but that's one example of a use for add noise. You can also just use it to add some grain to your image. Alright, I'm going to turn that off, and let's take a look at some other ones. Under Stylize, Oil Paint. Let's see what that does. Okay. So this kind of makes it look like an oil painting, and I've got to say that's actually doing a pretty decent job for being a single filter. It's not that bad. It definitely is computer generated. It's not going to pass for something that's actually oil painted, but there you go. It's something that Photoshop can do. And I'll be honest, before smartphones, this kind of thing was pretty impressive. You couldn't really make effects like this easily other than through a program like Photoshop. We didn't have little apps that made pictures look like they were these paintings or drawings. It was all done on computers in programs like Photoshop. So these menus are deep, complex, and there's all different kinds of categories. You can spend days digging through all of these. But if I'm being honest, about 99% of it is never touched in my workflow. And the reason for that is because After Effects is basically the Photoshop of video or animation. It has almost all of these effects built in, or at least the effects that I would want to use in After Effects itself, and I'm able to interactively adjust them in that program. One really great thing about After Effects is that all of the effects are completely non-destructive. You can adjust them at any time, turn them on and off, and even use an adjustment layer to apply an effect to multiple layers at once. Just like an adjustment layer in Photoshop will manipulate things like brightness or the saturation, you can apply an effect to an entire stack of layers underneath an adjustment layer. So like I said, 99% of the time I'm not applying these effects in Photoshop. It's usually for things like adding some grain, which you can also do in After Effects, or touch-up. I'm mostly just using Photoshop to do touch-up work, cutting photos out from their backgrounds, things like that. Let's take a look at this one, Sharpen. There's this one effect called Unsharp Mask, also available in After Effects, so I'm always using it there. But it can add some really interesting contrast to your image. You can see what this is doing. Let me just reset this. If you hold down Option on any one of these menus, it'll change the Cancel button into Reset, and then you can get to the default settings. But basically, this is trying to find parts of your image that already have a bit of contrast, and then exaggerate that contrast. And you have some controls for the intensity of that. You can change the radius, so if you bring it down it'll be much more subtle. If you bring it way up it gets super glowy. And I love this effect. It really produces some interesting results, and I use it a lot in my workflow inside of After Effects more often than not, but sometimes inside of Photoshop when I'm prepping assets. Alright, I'll cancel out of that, and then let's take a look at the filter gallery. That's right here, and it's going to open up a separate interface where we get a preview window. I can pan it around, zoom in and out down here. I'll leave it at 100%, but this is just going to organize a whole bunch of other types of filters that you can apply and mix around in kind of a more layered way. So if I were to pick something like colored pencil, I have some specific filters or specific settings for that filter. And these are all just going to apply different textures, different color effects to your image. And you can kind of see a preview of what each one of these is going to do in the thumbnail here. Now, like I said, these filters and effects were much more impressive back before we had smartphones that had processors in them that could handle photo manipulation like this. And most of the time, I'm not even touching the filter gallery in my workflow. But it is interesting because you can layer effects inside the filter gallery. Right here, it's basically a layer stack for the effects. So if I were to grab something like, I don't know, this water paper, it adds that texture on top of it. Then I could add another one by pressing New Effect Layer down here, and then maybe go down to this grain, and then I could add another one, put on some sprayed strokes, and it just is very interesting what you can do with all of these effects stacked on top of each other. It might not seem like much right now, but you could actually take something like this picture of a tiger and then turn on a bunch of smart filters, including some adjustments and other effects in the filter menu, and end up with something that looks like this, which is kind of supposed to look like a watercolor painting. This was the source image, and then stacking all these effects on top of it produced that watercolor effect. So first I brightened up the image, then I applied what's called a median, which you can find under Filter, Noise, Median, and that kind of just smooths everything out. It blends some of those colors together. Then I applied a Find Edges, which is again under Filter, Stylize, Find Edges. But then I took that effect and I double-clicked on these little arrows right here, which allows you to change the blend mode and opacity of that specific effect. So I changed it from normal, which would have produced something that looked like this, if I turn the opacity up, like that, and I changed it to multiply so that it got rid of all the brights, and I turned the opacity down to 70, and that kind of just gave a little bit of contrast to those edges. And then I went into the filter gallery, and this is where I stacked a couple of different filters that just gave the final touches. I used the watercolor effect and played around with the settings until it looked pretty nice, and then I added the palette knife texture on top of that to just kind of give a final polish. To finish this off, I could just grab a watercolor paper texture, Here's just a subtle texture. Bring that into my document. Make sure that it fills the entire document. And then set that to a blend mode of multiply as well. So then that's just going to add a little bit of watercolor paper texture. And I could increase the contrast by adding some curves. Command M or Control M on a PC is the shortcut for adding that adjustment. And I could just add in some more contrast, maybe bring that up a bit on the brights, bring down those darks. And then I'm going to desaturate the entire thing by using the keyboard shortcut for hue and saturation, which is Command U. And just turn the saturation all the way down. And there we go. Now I've got that watercolor texture on top of my watercolor effect, and it does produce a pretty decent looking watercolor effect, especially when you look at the original, which was just a photograph. So you can take these filters and effects very far in Photoshop, but like I said, the majority of the time I'm not using these effects in my motion design workflow. It's much more for something where I need to simulate a specific effect. So it's interesting and definitely something you can play around with, but not necessarily an essential part of motion design. Alright, now I'm going to grab a picture of my dog Pixel. This is him, and I'm going to show you another little effect in here called the liquify effect. This is separate from all of these other menus, and it's going to open up its own interface as well, kind of like the filter gallery. If you remember in my original podcast where I was kind of explaining my first introduction to Photoshop, there I was talking about an effect called twirl, and that is found in the liquify panel now. So twirl is right here. You can increase or decrease your size of your brush with the left and right bracket keys just like any other brush. But then if I click and drag, you can see that just twirls around your image as much as you are holding down on that. So obviously I didn't want to do that, so I'm going to undo. But you have some other tools that are very interesting, like I could make his eyes a little bit bigger, a little buggier. Or I could pucker his nose. So just bring that down a little bit and make some interesting weird looking images. At this point I'd say this is pretty much just a novelty tool. Again, I wouldn't use this in my motion design workflow necessarily, but if we bring in a photo of an actual person, here's my headshot, and then go into that liquify, Photoshop is actually going to be intelligent enough to identify this is a face, and we can go into the face aware liquify panel over here. And inside of this we have lots of really crazy controls. So we have eye size, and there's two numbers for left and right eye. If I turn this up, you can see how that's affecting my eye. I could link that up and make both my eyes a little bit bigger, or let's say a little smaller. Then I could increase my eye height, eye width. I could rotate my eyes one way or the other. I could change the distance between my eyes. I could grab my nose height and adjust that. Let's say I don't like how big my nose is. I'll bring that in and I'll make it a little bit wider. I could make myself smile a little bit more or a little bit less. I'll increase the size of my upper lip and decrease the size of my lower lip. It's really weird, right? I mean, there are some actual applications to this, but I think that it's more for actual photographers who need to make very minute adjustments to model photography for maybe fashion design or something like that. But I mean, you can do crazy stuff with this. And it starts looking really weird really quickly. So there we go. I've completely mutilated the structure of my face. We can turn the preview off and back on to see what that looks like, but it's just really weird. But very powerful. Something worth knowing exists, at least. Alright, let's jump back to that picture of my dog real quick and talk about one last set of filters, which is right here, blur. This is something that I actually do use inside of Photoshop every now and then. There are all different types of blurs that you can apply to your image. And Gaussian blur, or Gaussian it might be pronounced, is probably the most common one that I'm using inside of Photoshop and even in After Effects, but it's basically just going to blur out pixels. So, no pun intended. But it's really interesting. I could convert this to a smart object and then apply a Gaussian blur. So let's say filter blur Gaussian blur and maybe put it around 6. Click OK and then go into the blend settings for that effect, double clicking on this arrow and changing the blend mode to say soft light. And then click OK. So that's just kind of softening everything up. You see that the way this photo was edited, it already had some like photo grain trying to simulate film, but that's just going to kind of soften everything. And I could apply a curves adjustment and maybe try and brighten everything up, and maybe put that below the Gaussian blur. So it goes first by brightening it up and then adding that Gaussian blur. Now everything looks kind of glowy. Then I could, add a hue and saturation adjustment and turn the saturation down a little bit. So these are very powerful photo manipulation tools, but because you have access to most of these inside of After Effects, and they're generally much more flexible inside of After Effects, I again typically don't do this kind of thing inside of Photoshop. Alright, now let's take a look at Illustrator's effects. So here I am, blank document, and we take a look right up here. We have an effect menu, and this is broken up into two different categories: Illustrator effects and Photoshop effects. Really what that means is vector effects and raster effects. And inside of Illustrator, both of these categories are non-destructive. You're able to apply them, open them back up, make adjustments. It's never going to be applied to your graphics in a way that you can't mess with afterwards, unless you end up rasterizing your graphic inside of Illustrator. So let's just start by drawing a shape, just something like a blob. Doesn't have to be pretty. And then I'll fill it with a nice color. Let's say, I don't know, something like a blue. Okay, there's my shape. So let's take a look first at the Photoshop effects. Since we were just looking at the Photoshop effects in Photoshop, you'll notice that a lot of these overlap, which makes sense because they called them Photoshop effects. But the majority of these are exactly the same as what you would find inside the filter gallery in Photoshop. And for whatever reason, Illustrator calls it the effect gallery, but it opens up an interface that is almost identical to what was inside of Photoshop. It behaves the same way, you get the same kind of thumbnails, same kind of effects, and you can just play around with these and apply them to your graphics. So I could click OK, and now my shape has some grain to it. The thing you have to be aware of is that even though this is a live effect, or something that I could always go back into by just clicking on my object and then clicking on film grain, is that this is a raster effect. So all of Photoshop's effects are raster, even though they're live. That's kind of the way that you can think about it. A live effect is something that you can modify after applying it. It's not a destructive effect, but it is raster. So if I were to scale this up, the texture isn't going to get any bigger. It's just going to repeat that texture on my larger shape. So that's an important distinction between Photoshop effects and Illustrator effects inside of Illustrator. You also get some blurs. Not everything in this menu is just what shows up in the effect gallery. You've got something like the Gaussian blur again. I could turn up some blurriness here and just give it a nice soft edge. If I go too far, it's going to kind of get to its limits and cut it off, so be aware of stuff like that. Click OK, and there we go. Now it's kind of glowy. Just like in Photoshop, I'm not typically using effects inside of Illustrator. I separate my use in these programs, these tools, based on what they're best at. In Illustrator, I view it as the best tool for making vector shapes and graphics. Photoshop I view as the best place to prep photos and adding textures and things like that to graphics or photographs. And After Effects I feel like is the best program for obviously animating, but also building effects and looks, because it's very interactive, it's very easy to adjust, and it's very quick to render. If I do my effects and my looks inside of Illustrator and Photoshop, then I can't adjust that after it's been imported into After Effects. I'd have to go back into Photoshop or back into Illustrator to make those adjustments. So I'm going to get rid of those effects by opening my Appearance panel and then just deleting the blur, deleting the rough pastels. And now let's take a look at the Illustrator effects. So these are going to be your vector effects that are based on the actual vector paths. They're not just effects that are being applied onto the graphics and then rasterized. So like the distort and transform, we've taken a look at the zigzag effect already. That's just going to add some random movement on the edges of the path. You can control if it's smooth or if it's pointy. Nothing new there. I'm going to delete that effect and point out that you can also add new effects directly through the Appearance panel. And let's say we go to the Distort and Transform again and then look at Twist. So this one is going to twist your vector paths around. So let's not do something quite so extreme, maybe 180 instead. So that gives you something that just looks a little bit interesting, kind of like a hurricane icon on a weather map or something like that. The nice thing is that you can adjust these paths after the fact. You'll still see the outline and make something completely different looking. Maybe I didn't want this to be a closed path and I want it to be a stroke instead. It's still going to work because this is based on the vector paths and not the actual contents or the way that the object looks once it's rasterized. All right, I'm going to get rid of that twist and then take a look at some other ones. One very interesting one to know about is this transform. So let's say I wanted to make like a dial on a clock or some kind of a speedometer or something. I'll just make this black. And so let's say this is the housing for my speedometer, and I want to put all these different little notches indicating the speed that my driver is going. Well, this could be pretty difficult. I could do something like copy, paste in front, Command F, scale it down, and then maybe turn up my stroke width, and then add a dash. And then I've got all these little lines, so maybe something like this. Okay, so that's perfectly fine, but I'm constrained, I'm limited by the shape of that dash. I can't do anything to adjust the way that looks. Instead, I could do something like design a custom little dial piece. So I'm just going to make a thin rectangle and then maybe scale out the top a little bit so it has a bit of a taper. And then, I don't know, maybe I'll add another point in here, bring it down a little bit just so I have something that's a little unique. I'll round off these corners a little bit. Round off these corners a little bit, and I can even round off this point that I made. So there we go. We've got something a little bit more unique. And now I'm going to just put that right in the center of my circle. I'll select both of them, click once on the outer object, and then align to the center on both axes. Then I'll select it, go to Effects, Distort and Transform, and then Transform. Now, this is going to allow me to manipulate the scale, the position, the rotation, as well as make duplicates of the object. So first thing I need to do is turn my copies up to, let's just say 10, so we can see multiple objects being transformed. They're all right on top of each other right now, so I didn't see anything happen, and I don't have preview turned on. So I'm going to check that. But now I can do something like move on the horizontal, and you can see how this is now going to space out each one of these objects that distance, so 40 pixels. So I don't want to do that. Maybe I'll turn that down to 0, and then maybe turn up the vertical instead. So something like that. And then I can, rotate these objects too. And you see that with this rotation, it's incrementally applying this transformation. So let me play around with this a little bit more. I want more than just 100 pixels, but you can type in any number here. So I'm going to say 200, and then I'm going to change my rotation a little bit further. Maybe turn my copies up to 50, and then the angle is going to need to be turned down. So you can actually do math inside of these menus. If I wanted 50 copies to make a perfect 360-degree rotation, I would actually need to take 360 divided by 51, because the copies is not including the original. So 360 divided by 51 will give me the perfect number of degrees that I need to rotate each one of these by to make a perfect circle. Now, everything is going out too far now, so I'm going to turn this down and bring it in till it's about the same size as my circle. Alright, I'm going to click OK there, and obviously this isn't working the way that I need it to. I want all of these tick marks to be aligned to the circle. Well, because this is a live effect, I can still manipulate my source object. You see that I can't click on any of these duplicates, but I can manipulate this however I want. Say, rotate it 90 degrees, and all the other objects are going to update with it. I could thin this out a little bit on the y-axis so that they're not quite as thick. I could scale the entire thing down and then reposition it a little bit. Then I would need to go back into my transform and then increase the vertical distribution a little bit until it fits my circle a little bit better. But now I have this custom tick mark that's radially distributed around my circle, and at any point I can come in here and adjust this. So maybe I don't like the curves anymore. I want to get rid of that rounding. That's no problem. I can just come in and manipulate this however I want. And I can really fine-tune the way that these tick marks look. So there I've got something much more unique. I could then copy this shape, paste it in place, maybe scale it down a little bit and bring it inwards. and then change the shape completely. Again, maybe round it out on this end. I know this isn't the most exciting example, but hopefully you can see the possibilities that this is allowing you to make some very complex looking graphics using one source object and then repeating it in some very interesting ways. And one last thing, let's say that you like the way that this looks, but now you want to separate all of these objects so that you can manipulate each one individually. Well, with that selected, just come up to Object, Expand Appearance, and there you go. Now each one of these shapes is unique. They're grouped, so I could ungroup them with Command-Shift-G, but then I have access to every single one of them. Alright, so hopefully that gives you a pretty good glimpse into the filters and effects in both Photoshop and Illustrator. And now you can just go wild playing around with them, seeing how they affect things and if any of them might be useful to you as a design tool. Something I can't stress enough is how easily these can look cheesy. Don't use effects just to use effects. Only use them if they're actually helping you accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. Because once you start layering on all of these Photoshop effects that look kind of like something that was painted or sketched, it's going to throw up a red flag in everyone's mind. In today's day and age, where smartphones are so popular and you're able to do these photo manipulations so easily, people are going to know that you just photoshopped that, and it's not going to go well. So keep that in mind as you're playing around and learning about these filters and effects. If the opportunity arises, absolutely use them in your projects, but don't get too crazy.